Dishonored is a series I wouldn't have played if not for word of mouth. I don't like stealth games. I almost never do non-lethal playthroughs of storylines. I hate first-person melee. So I figured this just wasn't a series for me, until I tried it. Dishonored took me by total surprise. Each of the two games is equally complex and gorgeous, a blend of naturally presented world-building, a visual aesthetic drawn from oil paintings, and brilliantly balanced game systems. The thing I usually don't like about stealth is the pacing and the level design. Skulking in the shadows of bland hallways and dark vents, getting to know levels for their mechanical spacing without feeling engaged with them as elements of the story. Dishonored makes each step of the journey in between you and your target engaging on every level, visually, tonally, mechanically, motivationally. It operates with the same clockwork precision as the lightly steampunk technology you'll find yourself using. It's the artfulness of the games that really drew me in, and in a lot of cases, the literal art on the walls. Dishonored has a game world with a cohesiveness of vision and tone that's extremely rare. From the paintings, lush but stern, to the unbelievable detail put into the realistically proportioned and architecturally gorgeous environments, Dunwall feels like a city, a real one where people have lived whole lives, died, and been forgotten, where an industrial boom has led to a paralyzing bust with the coming of a rat plague. The sense of impatience that I usually feel when playing stealth titles completely evaporates in the face of the fact that any piece of Dunwall at all, from the highest rooftop to the darkest hallway, is an amazing place I wanted to be. As good as movies are at showing worlds and universes way beyond the scope of the realistic and possible, we're at the mercy of whatever perspective the director has chosen. When the movie moves on, we move along with it. Here, an open, interactive Dunwall succeeds at creating the illusion of an actual place, one that functions independently of any participation by the player, one laid open to inspection from all sides. In fact, it's this grounded, open sense of place and the naked indifference of the city which makes your actions feel so impactful. A sense of what things would be like if you didn't intervene is all around. A creeping dread that things will continue to get worse until it's just the rich and their houses surrounded by block after block of the dead and dying. You play as a wanted man, bodyguard to the Empress, caretaker of her daughter Emily, and a professional fixer of sorts. You've been away looking for answers about the mysterious rat plague that's devastated the city. You get back a few days earlier than scheduled, and if you'd arrived on time, it's later explained to you while you're disgraced and in chains, you wouldn't have had to take the fall for the Empress's death. As it stands, the Empress and Emily are some of the only genuinely good people in Dunwall. One's dead, one's kidnapped, and Corvo Otano, your character, is blamed for both crimes. Dishonored, like the title says. What you've got is a fantastic setup for a revenge thriller, but what kind of thriller that is depends entirely on you, the player. Taking your revenge in blood is both mechanically and tactically easier, with numerous opportunities both in the environment and through your assassin's toolkit for making the kill. But this kind of killing is just what's expected of you, the depraved and dangerous man who betrayed the Empress. If you kill 50 guards to get to your quarry, it changes things. People are on higher alert, rats fill the streets, hope seems dimmed and distant, and conversations are more sour. The game calls this a state of high chaos. It's a state where Dunwall is dying, and you're helping to twist the knife through your cruelties. The other option is to leave no trace, to defy your enemies and clear your name, undoing them while right under their noses. This is low chaos. Dishonored is two vastly different games depending on which state you aim for, yet each style is equally balanced and quite beautiful. The thing that marked this game as something special for me is that it talked me into playing in a way that's completely contrary to my deeply ingrained habits and preferences as a gamer. It offered 3 levels of tantalizing rewards to get me to change my ways. The first is narrative. To do good requires effort in Dishonored, in going through numerous extra steps, extra inconveniences in pursuit of a more orderly corrective that might repair some of the city's wounds. It's easy to slip in, kill a guy, and slip out. So you're talked into staying for longer by the second level of reward. The non-lethal method is always the most complicated use of space when it comes to the level design, using whole parts of the building and surrounding neighborhoods that the lethal path would probably ignore. To follow the non-lethal path gives the most answers about the place you're in and what's going on within. Even outside the written notes, the environmental design is so natural and realistically built that you learn volumes about the world and its characters by listening to them and witnessing their spaces. This is absolutely ancient game design technique, but this is the first time I've ever wholeheartedly enjoyed it with the traditional stealth pacing, waiting through entire dialogue exchanges until guards part to return to more secluded, shadowy paths. All of these guards, both men and women, feel like regular people with strong opinions and private vices, so killing them feels like it's actually a little murder. Even if it is self-defense, you're a better swordsman than any of them ever were. They don't stand a chance. The challenge is not fending them off, although they fight well, it's in sparing them, despite themselves. They might be disagreeable bastards, or they might be stern professionals, or they might be poor parents putting in hours at their job. You just don't know. But it's their sworn duty to throw themselves at you until you die, or they die. Unless, of course, they don't see you at all. So the game offers magical powers and a tranquilizer crossbow and a host of other mechanics that give the player a genuinely diverse array of practical, tactical options to navigate the level spaces in a non-lethal, quiet way. And even if you screw up, the game has a mechanical allowance for failure. So long as your overall casualties are lower than 20%, so long as 4 out of 5 of all characters from noble to guard to plague victim are alive at the end of the game, the low chaos state is preserved. So that's the third level of reward, a series of systems that support and forgive in ways that resonate with the more abstract themes of the plot and the mood of the city. It's similar to how it was accomplished in Metro 2033 and Metro Last Light, where stealth approaches and kind deeds added up to radically different outcomes in the plot. The thing for me, though, is that Metro was never successful in getting me to actually change my playstyle. Although I tried to shoehorn in enough good acts to make up for it, I just had no patience for waiting long periods of time in such dark and cramped spaces as the Russian Metro. Dishonored's world, with its long winding streets and smoky rooftops, is so much wider and more free than Metro's. Its systems, like the ability to flash from point to point across long distances with blink, make navigating the space much quicker and more playful than that game too. It's not just high chaos versus low chaos. It's about how outrageously well synchronized all of these elements are, narrative and mechanical and spatial all, at the same time in any given moment, and how persuasive and powerful that resonance is. The plot itself is nothing particularly special, and you'll probably be able to predict most of the beats. When paired with the exaggerated, sculpted character designs, though, and larger-than-life fashions and uniforms they wear, the tone comes across as a kind of dark revenge fable, a violent storybook. Corvo saves the princess. The villains are villainous, and the heroes aren't actually much better. Everyone's a bit of an archetype and a caricature. From the cowardly and vain Lord Pendleton, an ally who not only sends you to kill his 2 brothers, but also ropes you into fighting a duel in his name without telling you that's what's going down, to Admiral Havelock, who threatens one of the only people in the city capable of curing the rat plague with, ironically, death by hungry rats. Or the game's most iconic face, Granny Rags, a semi-lucid witch with dull, milky eyes and a variety of evil requests. Susan Sarandon voiced her and did a beautifully creepy job of it. None of them seem realistic, but they all fit together appropriately, an excess of style and characterization that seems well at home against the dark rat-filled alleyways and glimmering palatial estates. There is no doubt that each villain you have the option to kill kinda deserves it. And it's not like the other way necessarily shows mercy, either. Each non-lethal elimination of your major target falls into a fate-worse-than-death kind of category. For example, your first major target, High Overseer Campbell, is having over an incorruptible officer for drinks with the intention of poisoning him. You can swap the poison and kill Campbell, but then the officer will be accused of the deed. You can poison both and leave no witnesses, or you can shatter both glasses, whereupon Campbell takes the officer downstairs to kill him in a louder way within his soundproofed private chambers. It's only this latter option that lets you actually rescue the officer, who flees when you render the overseer unconscious, leaving you with the sleeping body of a dangerous man. Then you gotta haul his heavy ass all the way back upstairs to a diagonally opposite wing of the building, where you have to quietly set him down in an interrogation chair and brand his face with the mark of the heretic. He'll be forever shunned from his order. Instead of unifying the organization in the wake of a popular leader's brutal murder, the entire order is demoralized and shaken. Faith in their authority is eroded. The result is more advantageous than if you had simply killed him, and he winds up dead anyway. In a much later mission in the game, Campbell can be found as a weeper, one of those terminally ill with the rat plague and gone mad, bleeding from the eyes. Or how about Lord Pendleton's brothers? To take care of those two, you have to acquire the code for a safe for a local thug named Slackjaw. Slackjaw then abducts the brothers, cuts out their tongues, and sells them as slaves to work in their own mines as repayment for the safe code. There's no mercy there. And then there's what happens to Lady Boyle. Boyle's a liar and a social climber, but you send her away to become locked up in a creep's basement forever. So you got a choice between murder 1 and accessory to rape, and that is a pretty shit choice. If you're only giving the player one non-lethal option, maybe don't force them to do something so unbelievably skeezy. The game might as well have had Goodbye Horses playing in the background as you deliver her over to the guy. Lady Boyle's the unpleasant exception to the nonviolent outcomes, though. Her fate is not an ironic comeuppance. It's just gross and sad, a lone example of the game choosing a cheap shock over something more grounded in character. Everyone else, though, gets something that seems appropriate, something that justifies the extra inconvenience and presents twists and turns that are less predictable than if you'd simply gone stab-happy. The ironic reversals of the non-lethal eliminations just intensifies that feeling of storybook unreality. It gives Corvo definition as well, giving the player a chance to flesh out and personalize their character through action. There's not a lot of dialogue for Corvo outside of a few binary choices, but there doesn't really need to be. Who he is inseparable from what he does, how the player chooses for him to behave. The Corvo who shows up to a costume party dressed as himself and leaves no trace that he was there, who listens to guards discuss their marriage problems from afar and leaves them alive to hopefully one day solve them, who turns the whole city against the Lord Regent with the Regent's own words. That Corvo is fundamentally more interesting than the Corvo who poisons, who stabs, who the city knows as a cold-blooded killer inside and out. The game will weave you a story about either Corvo, but it's not something you choose from a dialogue wheel. Moment to moment, you must choose to use the shadows or a blade, to hide or stand your ground, to show patient compassion or satisfying cruelty. The stories of the characters who surround you are much more involved than Corvo's, much more detailed in the telling. There's only one thing besides revenge that motivates Corvo, and that's his devotion to Emily, daughter of the late Empress. Again, this isn't something especially novel in a game. Bioshock 2 plays it nearly the same way, with a precocious kid whose moral compass is spun in different directions by witnessing the approach of the player-controlled male guardian figure. It was such a common trope for a few years that articles were written decrying the dadification of games, decrying the cheapness of using a father-daughter dynamic as an easy, simple way to smear a layer of emotional connection on top of whatever's going on in the plot. In Dishonored, though, the world has enough of an individual artistic vision, enough solidity and gravitas, that it actually works. Emily and Corvo obviously have an important connection, and they're the only things that remain of each other's lives before the Empress was killed. If Corvo uses violent revenge to cut down man after man, and then some women, and maybe a dog on his path to revenge, and then gets his damn revenge to boot, Emily takes note. Revenge works. Violence is an answer, sometimes a useful and convenient answer. In these high-chaos endings, Dunwall never recovers, and Emily becomes a tyrant. Terrible damages are made permanent because Corvo took the easy way out. It's a fun way, too. Many of Corvo's magical powers are highly lethal, only useful for a playthrough where you're killing way more than 1 in 5. Grenades explode with tremendous power. Sword combat is smooth and powerful for first-person melee. The options for murder are not only tactically useful, but visually spectacular. The entertainment value of it, for the player, is really high. And the relatively forgiving 20% murder threshold even allows small explosions of violence to take place without sacrificing low chaos. Corvo's not a bad guy. Just don't tap him on the back when he isn't expecting it. Results are dire. It's a harsh world, and a little self-defense doesn't get taken the wrong way, but if killing is Corvo's default response, and anyone could be next, they start acting like it, and any goodwill they might have towards Corvo completely evaporates. You have to work to earn trust, to restore your honor. I found that compelling to the point where I yielded to the game's non-lethal playstyle completely, gave myself over to a new way of navigating a first-person space. The final level completely changes depending on if you've managed a low-chaos playthrough or if you've stabbed your way into a high-chaos ending. With King Sparrow Island either engulfed in fog and rain with 2 disloyal loyalists to kill, or clear as a spring day with your betrayers already dead, themselves betrayed by their own scheming. So either Corvo takes justice into his own hands and with his own crossbow, or the same fates that Corvo had been delivering by non-lethal means take on a life of their own and do Corvo's work for him. There are a few different ways that everything can pan out, and the gameplay difference between the well-armed, highly populated island on high chaos and the smooth quiet of infiltrating on low chaos is tremendous. You get the climax you deserve, as a player and a character both. It's this synthesis of mechanical engagement, level design, and narrative design that makes Dishonored so deeply compelling. It unfolds in a complex way depending on long-term player behavior, and on top of a few instances of binary choice, and not just a few instances of binary choice. Even if it's got a hodgepodge of predecessors and influences, not least of all the old IDOS Thief games, Dishonored managed to transcend its own design cliches by being authentically itself on every artistic front, by using with genuine passion the gameplay tropes and ideas that can be found elsewhere. It's not just the individual components, it's the blend. Whatever lineage any given mechanic or story beat descends from, its configuration in Dishonored is charming and likable and structurally sound enough to warrant its inclusion. Dishonored is an extraordinarily tight game, just a handful of levels that are packed to the brim with multiple paths and hidden solutions. It's eminently replayable, not just for low chaos versus high chaos, but for all the in-between spaces where you suddenly look up at the rafters and realize you might have gone right over the top of some of the guards you spent so long tranquilizing, or spot a rat tunnel leading off towards something hidden and remember, oh hey, I can possess rats, and so peel back your whiskers and go through the tiny crevice. Dishonored's levels are marvels. The spaces are used in ways that seem architecturally natural and human, but service the gameplay in a myriad of helpful ways. When you first come to Dunwall Tower in the introductory level, for example, your boat is raised in a complicated waterlock. Later in the game, you'll have to traverse that vertical distance by magic and feats of agility. Side streets feel just like a slice of the larger city, and anytime you go into a place, you have to come back out again. A level never ends just because you've completed the objectives. You always have to exfiltrate the area as well. Again, in another game, I would have found it really tedious, but here it just made me feel like I was in Corvo's shoes a little more. It was a critical piece of the pacing and experience that makes Dishonored such a satisfying stealth title. The only exception is the final level. Once the conspirators are dead by your hand or their own, and Emily is safe, the game is over. The story ends. The epilogue is then relayed to you by a character named the Outsider, a magical being who gives his chosen a mark on their hand by which magic is accomplished. Corvo's got one, and the man who actually did kill Empress Caldwell has another. Both of the major pieces of DLC, The Knife of Dunwall and The Witches of Brigmore, have Daud the Assassin as the protagonist. Daud's the real killer, a murderer for hire only separable from regular thugs by his skill and foresight. Oh, and his magical powers. The DLC all takes place after the Empress is killed, where Daud is having second thoughts. He's used to having blood on his hands, but even he can't escape the gnawing sensation that this time he went much too far and may have doomed the city entirely. Low chaos and high chaos states are incorporated just like in the main game, and even carry over between DLCs. If you play The Knife of Dunwall in low chaos, Witches of Brigmore will pull data from your save pile and also begin in a low chaos state. But more than that, it's up to you to either play out or ignore Daud's moral crisis. Do you actively seek out alternative methods of dealing with a target? Do you spare the lives of the common guards and citizens who might stand in your way? Do you let Daud choose another path for himself? If you do, there are consequences. Those in his gang worry he's going soft and actively conspire against him. Daud's a killer to begin with, unlike Corvo. Corvo's dilemma is whether he will become the monster that people expect or hold tight to his humanity. Daud's dilemma is whether you can take a step backwards from the abyss, whether there's a point in an evil man's life where he might see himself differently. Although there's only 6 missions, Daud comes across as a slightly more concrete character than Corvo, with more of his own voice in the narrative, and with a definitive endpoint to the story, where Corvo encounters him late in the game. Even if you play Daud as low chaos, he'll still fight Corvo in the main plot. He'll still have killed the Empress, but the moment when Corvo chooses to spare Daud or kill him high atop his stronghold in the Flooded District, you get to play that from both perspectives. In the DLC, if Daud's been played in a low chaos style, Corvo spares him. If Daud doesn't bother to learn mercy, neither does Corvo. In the main game, it's the player, as Corvo, that judges the man. He tossed your stuff down a really inconvenient hole in the ground. He destabilized the Empire. He's kind of a jackass. He kind of deserves it. Doesn't he? That's what's so fun about the Dishonored DLCs. For the most part, they shed light on the main plot and help set up the villain for the next game, but in critical and curious ways, it also makes the game's morality system, as binary as it is, feel a little deeper. No one lives in Dunwall and keeps their hands clean, Daud less than most, but Daud's a man in a real transitionary state when Corvo finds him on the other end of his blade. It's hard to say if mercy is deserved, but it's obvious that Daud would do well with mercy if it was given. While you mull this dilemma over, you're given 6 levels just as complex and sprawling as anything in the main campaign, some of which I'd rank as the most gorgeous and impressive in Dishonored 1 in general. Knife of Dunwall's first to Captain of Industry is certainly one of those levels. Taking place at a whale slaughterhouse at the height of a vivid golden sunset, it's a spectacular mashup of blood and light. You also learn quite a bit about the world. You already know that whale oil is the basis of the economy, which always seemed a little silly, but seeing up close in this level the bizarre whales of this world with their tentacle whiskers marks Dishonored as taking place somewhere and sometime quite obviously other, despite its familiar elements. Whale oil would be absurd in a world like ours, but Dishonored isn't really like ours very much at all. And then the game throws in some world building that's deeply connected to our own, showing a slaughterhouse right out of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, complete with rivers of blood and viscera and supervisors who sometimes murder their own workers if they're discovered to have pro-union sentiments. Infiltrating the slaughterhouse through the drainpipe, you come up this river of filth until it opens up above, revealing one of the giant whales suspended from the ceiling, gutted but still alive. Apparently, if you keep the whale alive while extracting their oil, according to a nearby book, you'll get a better yield of high-quality combustible goop. The whale's agonized cries fill the enormous space of the factory floor. Meanwhile, two supervisors threaten a worker with a circular saw, and if you don't intervene, they will kill him with it. Sorta accidentally, letting his body slide into the river of blood flowing in your direction. You can put the whale out of its misery, you can save the worker, or you can let both suffer and hide amongst the distracting agony. It's this kind of thing that makes Dishonored so damn compelling, presenting a world both exotic and familiar, allowing you to navigate it guided primarily by your instincts as a player and as a human. Of course, it's all digital and imaginary, but if you've got your disbelief properly suspended, I just can't see walking away from the whale without helping it along to its inevitable end. Dunwall is a city of wonders, but all those wonders are born out of exploitative cruelty. The next level, the Legal District, is equally good, partly on account of the fact that it's the level used in the demo for the earliest playable builds of this game. It's quite literally a distillation of all the tonal and gameplay ideas in Dishonored, a trial run for the whole game concept. Guards even comment on why it looks a little differently than the other districts. Less dirty, wealthier, explaining in plot terms the level's existence as an early artistic concept of Dunwall. They talk about how the man you're after, Barrister Timpsch, has systematically sent his neighbors to prison so that he can ransack the wealth of their estates. The guy's misdeeds actually get mentioned by a number of characters in the main campaign. It's very satisfying to finally get a crack at him here. And the method of non-lethal takedown is one of the most ironic and delightful of the whole game, on top of being one of the most complicated. If you're just going to stab the guy, it's easy, he's on the top floor. And if you come through one of the balconies, he's quite vulnerable. But to really put the screws to the old fucker, you've got to first find a bag of dead rats. Then you got to put the dead rats in his ventilation system. But before the health officials show up to investigate the stench, you got to sneak up behind him, pickpocket the papers he carries rendering him immune to search and seizure, and replace them with a document that he himself signed, altered slightly to condemn both him and his property to prison and state seizure. When the health official gravely informs him that the papers are legit and he's going away for the rest of his miserable old life as a plague risk, he faints. Out of all the well-deserved fates of the game, this one is the most darkly comical and solid. Dunwall is full of slippery, evil people, and there's a lot less of them around when Daud and Corvo are through. Powerful and interesting villains are one of the real draws of the Dishonored games, and the DLC is notable for featuring cunning and ruthless women in the top villain slots. In Knife of Dunwall, it's Billy Lurk. Billy's second-in-command to Daud, and it's her who sells Daud out to the Overseers in Knife of Dunwall's final mission. Lurk is ambitious and competent. She's invaluable help in the previous missions, appearing to lend advice after scouting ahead. That mechanical familiarity makes her betrayal particularly fun. She's obviously qualified to judge Daud as being qualified to continue to lead or not, and her vote of no confidence in him says a lot about Daud's moral uncertainty. Is reaching out to be a kinder man also making him a weaker man? Is Billy Lurk actually wrong for betraying Daud, or is she simply the more professional killer between the two of them? And then there's Delilah Copperspoon. She shows up at the end of Knife of Dunwall, but she's the total focus of Witches of Brigmore. Magic is one of the more mysterious and dark elements of Dishonored. The only character who seems to have any actual knowledge about its function and history is the Outsider, who appears as a young man, but is obviously much older. Every generation, he chooses less than a dozen or so people who sit at the crossroads of great events to bear his mark and wield magic. He chooses Corvo after the Empress dies. He chose Daud a long time before, putting him in the position to wield that fateful knife. Delilah, however, seems to wield a different kind of magic entirely. Instead of the dark streams of energy and obscure altars to the outsider hidden in the secret backrooms of Dunwall, her magic is all vines and flowers and a riot of natural beauty. Compared to the grit and stains of industrial Dunwall, her magic is actually a literal breath of fresh air. But she's got a dark heart. She's trying to use her magic and her artwork to possess the soul and body of Emily Caldwell, the young heir to the throne. By painting a portrait that she can focus her magics into, she will seize the throne by controlling its occupant. It's a fitting final villain. Dishonored is a game of art, of highly stylized portraiture and street scenes brought to life. Delilah is a character who wields that power of art explicitly. And Brigmore Manor is my pick for most impressive and lush location in the entire game. The Brigmore Manor itself is huge, dwarfing the estates found within city limits. It looks, on the outside, like it was wealthier than the ones within the city as well. It's genuinely beautiful, doubly so because Delilah's cult's nature magic has made the grounds a verdant paradise. Once you finally sneak your way inside, that aesthetic turns dark. The hallways are waterlogged and ruined, all the splendor gone rotten with the intrusion of the witch's unnatural nature. And the plants, which seemed on the outside so magnificent, look snarled and sick on the inside. But the magic is still impressive, a meaningful twist on the game's abiding philosophy that shades of grey are more mechanically interesting to explore than black and white. In the main campaign, Granny Rags has the same dark and twisted city magic that Daud and Corvo share, all shadows and rats, the outsider's magic. Delilah's magic is something that reflects her artistic sensibility, chaos and leaves in a world committed to grim and despairing order. She's a great villain. The writers, I think, must have agreed they thought enough of her that they didn't just leave her plot arc to sit hidden in the DLC, which invariably far fewer people play than the main campaign. They scooped her right out and seated her on Emily's throne within the first 5 minutes of Dishonored 2. Dishonored 2 is a great game that takes a minute to clarify that to the player. It's the wrong foot to start off on by flat-out recycling the villain of the first game's DLC. The Witches of Brigmore was great, but is Delilah enough to bookend an entire full-game revenge plot? On the surface, both Dishonoreds rely on conspiracies where the villains are known up front and whose conspiracy slowly unravels over the course of the game, but the first Dishonored was invested more in having twists and turns in the narrative, by switching villains and challenging Corvo's motivations for continuing down either lethal or non-lethal paths. The second has a sequel's confidence in its basic structure and spends less time trying to unravel things in a narratively natural way. It begins with a real abruptness compared to the first game, putting a poised and professional Empress Emily and an older, gruffer Corvo in the same room as their usurper, who shows up and seizes the throne within 5 minutes. The player's emotional connection to the characters is assumed, a familiarity with the world's aesthetic is assumed, and so the sequel blows past most of the leisurely paced world-building of the first game. For Dunwall, anyway. Your troubles begin in Dunwall with the betrayal and the escape, and then end in Dunwall when you return for the final level to confront Delilah. The bulk of the story takes place in faraway Karnaca, piecing together how Delilah's conspiracy formed and what direction it might take later. It's a past-tense narrative experience for the most part, following a trail that's mostly cold, introducing characters who are more tangentially related to the revenge plot than the original's villains. The game would have been a lot tighter had it opened in Karnaca and stayed there, following new characters, and letting you get to know them along a similar arc to the first game. But the formatting was always more important to what makes Dishonored unique than the characters. To be honest, coming back around to Emily and Corvo has a real Weekend at Bernie's 2 feel. I mean, sure, we had a wild weekend, man, but Bernie's, dead. The epilogue for Dishonored was solid and far-ranging, and the game was genuinely pretty self-contained. So now you have a villain you've already defeated coming in to cause trouble for characters whose fates you already sealed. I can't believe I was dishonored again, Corvo might as well intone, but when the game arrives in Karnaca, it manages to surpass the first in intricate, balanced level design. There is never any single path, any combination of tactics and powers that's wholly invalid. If you think you can, you probably can, and if you think you can't, take a few minutes poking at it to make sure. The level of detail in the environment, from the ways avenues of advancement are crafted through the streets and up the staircases to the statues and paintings that line the hallways, they're every bit as detailed as the first game, but much lusher and sharper in their presentation. Each level has a self-contained concept that the first Dishonored didn't really have. On the story level, Dishonored 2 starts rough and proceeds a little flatly, but on the mechanical level, Dishonored 2 handily surpasses the original and presents some of the most memorably concrete spaces I've ever explored in a first-person game. It's a game that demonstrates very clearly that the success or failure of games can hinge on entirely different criteria than other creative works, even within the same series. And it begins with Corvo and Emily. That initial scene where Emily's throne gets usurped by Delilah gives the player a choice. Will you play as the Empress or her faithful old bodyguard? If you play as Corvo, you get to use some of the same powers in the same ways as the original game, plus some new toys and tricks on top of it, but the base mechanical experience of playing Corvo, what he can and can't do, and how he can navigate the environment, is preserved from one game to the other, although you have to start back at the bottom of the upgrade tree. But Emily is a wholly different set of powers given to her also by the Outsider, who visits her like he visited Corvo. They got a similar feel to Corvo's, but more focused on misdirection and manipulation. She can link together 4 enemies with a power called Domino. What happens to one happens to everyone else in the chain. So if you can chain several guards together from afar, and then take down the one on the very edge where the others can't see or hear, they all fall down, either dead or unconscious. It's ridiculously powerful. It doubles, triples, quadruples the efficiency of things like sleep darts, or even just a well-placed blade between the shoulders. She can create phantasmic versions of herself that either pop into a cloud of dust and leave guards confused, or fight the guards, sometimes lethally. Either way, if guards kill the doppelganger, they'll think that they killed Emily, and they'll drop any alarms they've got going. When you finish the game with one character or another, you can enter into a New Game Plus mode where you play one character through the story with all the powers you got from the other character. You're absurdly overpowered by doing this, but having a much wider range of tactical options actually makes playing on the harder difficulties appealing to schlubs like me who get very irritated about having to repeat sections and wait in shadows for danger to pass. But more to the point, Corvo and Emily are characterized as people through the ways they can mechanically interact with the world as much as their given definition in the script. We draw conclusions about their temperament and personality from their powers and features and abilities. Emily's younger, less accustomed to the shadows, so her long-jumping ability doesn't pause time like Corvo's. If you leap past someone, they'll notice. But her powers are also more raw than Corvo's. She can make herself more stealthy supernaturally by shape-shifting into a dark liquid creature able to slink along the floors and suck the life right out of a guard's face. You're not just choosing how the plot comes together, high chaos or low chaos, you're also choosing from a couple different flavors of protagonist, each with a list of features. 2 new rhythms for moving through the level, besides quiet and loud. But that's one gamble that really paid off. The levels themselves are much more self-consciously themed and styled than the previous game, leading to a mechanical experience that's a little purer, on top of a world that's just as colorful and exaggerated as the first. The level most people are blown away by is the Clockwork Mansion, where Karnaka's great inventor Jinjosh designs, tests, and shows off his inventions. Much is made of how Jinjosh is both smarter and more of a bastard than Sokolov, the first game's mad scientist figure. In fact, retrieving Sokolov from Jinjosh's basement is the whole reason you're there in the first place. Jinjosh won't be able to mass-produce his clockwork soldiers, these genuinely intimidating killing machines of gears and brass, without Sokolov's help. But leave aside the mad scientist versus mad scientist angle, the whole mansion is designed as a labyrinthine death maze where anyone who strays from the marked visitors' corridors, who has the gall to touch one of the numerous and thoroughly tempting levers and dials all around the estate, becomes Jindosh's next lab rat. No matter how cleverly you advance, you're still being watched, evaluated, tested, which is a lot more fun than it is sinister, to actually have an audience for your craftiness in a game like this. There are guards and human enemies in the backspaces where there's offices and hallways, but the real foe is Jindosh's imagination. His soldiers, his architecture, his beautiful traps. I don't think gaming's ever had a death maze so inviting and elegant and classy as the one in Dishonored 2. It was a small thing in this level that actually even pushed me into buying the series. Someone on Twitter posted a quick clip of themselves examining the detail of woodwork on one of Jindosh's wooden lion statues. From the nails to the grain of the wood to the way the light hit the lacquer on top, it looked not only vivid and realistic, but artistically sensical as well, something someone would actually create and think beautiful enough to have in a space like this, something expensive and elegant and rare. It's a small detail, but it's a small detail that wildly surpasses the way a similar object would be handled in most games. There's plenty of examples in gaming of lifestyles of the rich and famous brought to life, but few compelling enough to get people to stop in the middle of what they're doing and look at art as art, not just soaking in the decorative details as a transitory blur, but stopping to marvel at a single object's detail and craft and skill and intent. Obviously, making such a statue in a game is not quite as impressive as the woodworking skill needed to make something like it in real life. But to make something that exists only as information on a hard drive that fools the eye and fools the heart into perceiving it as a thing of actual wood and metal, I mean, that is a hell of an accomplishment. The depth of detail was present in the first game, but the first game had a bit of a cel-shaded, painterly look to it that the second game abandons in favor of high-definition realism. But because of all the different effects going on, the lighting, the shadows, the carefully placed vistas and overlooks and perspectives, all of that comes together to create something very much like the original's oil painting-inspired look, while introducing a sharpness to it that just wasn't there before. It's a beautiful, beautiful game in a way that's difficult for first-person games to capture a lot of the time. Call of Duty games, for example, especially in the past half-decade or so, have had environmental artists working at just as high a level, producing levels with just as much insane fidelity to background detail as Dishonored 2. But war shooters are obligated by format to move you through those spaces with tremendous speed, non-player characters screaming for the player to run along and catch up if they do something like dawdle in front of a sunset seen through a shattered skyscraper window, or a fountain in the square of some war-torn village. Dishonored 2's entire mechanical arrangement hinges on exploring an environment I'd guess maybe 3 times slower than you would in a run-and-gun game. This allows players to not only this allows the developers to not only create individual objects that are artful and noteworthy, but gives implicit motivation for the players for stopping to smell the roses that the designers have programmed in. Dishonored's levels are full of secrets and surprises, and only genuine, open-eyed observation reveals them. The Clockwork Manor is one of the greatest level design achievements of recent years, not only for that detail, but also because without the pressure and momentum of a shoot-'em-up format, they can make the entire level a literal puzzle box, something that the player has to hold in their hands and rotate and fret over for hours. The original Dishonored had a similarly self-contained and discrete level set, but in the sequel, even the narrative momentum is boiled off, the overarching plot being tied to events that have already transpired and thus don't require a speedy resolution. In sacrificing narrative urgency, Dishonored 2 gains a leisure of exploration that's not only appropriate, but deeply satisfying for the kind of game it wants to be. Almost all of the levels are as intricate, and many of them rival the Clockwork Mansion in terms of detail and elegance. The previous level, the Addermire Institute, is a vast and crumbling research hospital, which is a setting that's been done a million times before, but Dishonored 2 doesn't make it so much of a gloomy sanitarium full of blood and torture. Instead, the Addermire was once, obviously, incredibly grand and visionary. Some of the medical science is a little wide of the mark if you read the notes, but all of the Institute's business was conducted respectfully and professionally and with genuine good intent. I was shocked how novel that felt in a video game. In real life, of course, research hospitals are almost universally like this, staffed by well-trained people with good intentions. But in video games, it seems like it's hard to resist the horror hospital aesthetic. Hospitals are places of fear and death in a lot of people's experience of them, and it's easy to take that vibe and crank it up with monsters and killers. And the Addermire certainly does have a bit of the horror aesthetic, with Dr. Hypatia's boss monster form, all yellow eyes and claws and cartoonish serums and anti-serums that they deal with to solve that problem. But what's novel and noteworthy is showing that what destroyed the Institute was politics. The corrupt Duke Luca Bell took what he wanted and shut the place down, then the military came and took over. The ruin, you see, comes from neglect alone, not some battle, not some demonic invasion. Sarkonos was once a place of progress and beauty, but the villains in charge of the city drove it into the ground with their self-interest. It's a fine contrast to Dunwall, though that city was also run by corrupt oligarchs. It was also being depopulated by the rat plague, by the mess and runaway greed of industrialization. The city was an absolute mess, and it reflected its own vices in its urban design. Sarkonos is beautiful in a way Dunwall never was. Much more modern feeling. Take Duke Luca Bell's palace, for instance. Instead of a moldering medieval ruin, it's an incredibly sharp and modern structure. Large, but not huge, all angles and bold geometry, a building that reflects how ahead of the times Sarkonos is, or was before the hard times it's been having. The game takes place in an alternate mid-1800s. The palace looks like something Frank Lloyd Wright would have designed in the early 20th. By the standards of the world, it's futuristic design. Like the statue as I was talking about earlier, it's an example of creating an object that's crafted artistically and realistically within its own discipline. The palace is an incredible-looking building by the standards of real-world buildings. The statues beautiful by standards of real-world statues. Video games are themselves art, even ridiculous and silly video games, but what's impressive here is that art within art, the genuine grandeur of the game world, how grounded it feels. There have been game worlds that seem real and natural because of the depth of their writing, because of the weight of the ideas, because of the vastness of the landscapes. There's a huge range of creative choices that can create deep immersion for the player, foster that impression of weight and reality. The Dishonored games are kind of special because they accomplish it through visual art and architecture and the design of everyday objects in a way that's so much more complete and concrete than many of their first-person peers. By putting the narrative on the back burner and visual design on the front, the level design really soars when the game gets playful with mechanical features that don't exactly make a lot of sense as a script feature. The Jindosh lock and the magic twisted estate that lies behind it are the best example. Aramis Stilton was a good man, a miner who worked his way up to eventually run the whole operation. He treated his employees well, but he allowed the Duke to perform a magic ritual in his house to bring Delilah back from the dead, which drove him mad and ripped a hole in time. The Duke had his whole estate sealed off with a Jindosh lock, a combination lock wherein you read a logic puzzle about a dinner party, deduce what accessories belong to what guest, and then the doors will swing wide. The puzzle is sitting right next to the lock for anyone to attempt. This makes no sense, but it's very charming and massively difficult. The puzzle is randomized every playthrough, so players can't simply look up the answer on their smartphones. You actually have to think and solve it. You alone. Not that I managed to. I couldn't even figure out how to organize the information provided in the riddle. But it was so much fun to try, to stop in the middle of sneaking up on people and choking them out, bust out a notebook, and make a bunch of confused scribbles on the paper. The assumption is that most players will not solve the puzzle, so they get an entire level to explore as an alternative, the Dust District. You can get the key by supporting one side of a street conflict between a gang called the Howlers and the authoritative Overseers. You can kill one group's leader for the other, you could kill everybody, you could sneak around and steal the solution without anybody knowing you were even there. It's a very straightforward mechanical level. 2 zones, 2 factions, 4 solutions, with a fifth solution of solving the lock yourself if you're a major smarty-pants. This is a very artificial place. It would never exist like this outside the game, but for the rhythms of the game and the ways you interact with it, it is a pitch-perfect level. It's hugely fun. And the district itself has the same attention to detail as the rest of the city. Even if it is wholly unrealistic as a neighborhood, it still gives a meaningful impression of that. So much of video games is mental sleight of hand, distracting you with a flourish to hide its practical action. Dishonored 2's showmanship with that kind of thing is really remarkable. Once you get inside the estate, a new mechanic is introduced that ties together the most satisfying aspects of the game's aesthetic. Limited time travel. All your magic powers are temporarily taken away, save this one new ability. The ability to move back and forth between the present, where the mansion is a dank ruin not unlike the Brigmore Manor, and the night of the ritual, where everything is bright and colorful and decadent. The ability has tremendous value mechanically. If you're being chased in one time stream, simply slip into the next one. A collapsed hallway in the present is wide open in the past. A locked door in the past might have a hole in the wall in the future. Navigating like this, between event and aftermath, is also an experience only possible in video games. Not just to see a movie cut from one thing to another, or to read about both, but to have both timelines roll continuously forward at the same time, independently of the player's imagination, the player flipping between them at will, like changing channels on the television. And then, once you've gotten through the time maze of the estate, you find Stilton in a gazebo on his back porch, worrying about the consequences of the ritual. What you decide to do with him changes the present time stream in crazy ways. If you kill him, the house becomes an empty, dusty, but otherwise ordinary building, drained of magic and waiting for a new owner. If you knock him out, though, he lives past the ritual, with his mind intact. The mansion is as wonderful in the present as it was in the past, and newly filled with guards and servants. The Dust District is no longer full of dust and desperate men, but the regular working-class neighborhood it was before Duke Abel took over the mines. And more, Megan Foster has her eye and arm back, having never lost them in the newly minted present. Time amplifies good and bad deeds. Single actions send ripples into the future. These are not new concepts, but these are wonderfully novel ways of illustrating those concepts. The non-violent solutions to the levels all skew in this direction, away from ironic revenges and towards actions that are more reparative and restorative. The Crown Killer, Dr. Hypatia, can be restored to her former self. Stilton's madness can be prevented from ever taking hold. Delilah's apprentice can be stripped of her powers and set free. Duke Bell can be usurped, with your help, by his body double. Even Delilah is portrayed as sympathetic in some way, a woman of vision and talent whose accomplishments were devalued because of her class. It's only Jindosh who gets a truly harsh, non-violent resolution like the original game. You pretty much give the guy an electric lobotomy. Having his wits taken from him is a rough way for him to go out. He would rather be dead than unable to string a sentence together. But that's what you get. While not as uncomfortable a revenge as what happened to Lady Boyle in the first game, it's still a revenge that is thoroughly cruel. Although it's redeemed a bit by an audio recording found later in the game where Duke Bell is trying to get Jindosh to explain his total lack of progress, getting more and more frustrated as Jindosh fails to coherently explain anything. If Jindosh had simply been killed, measures would have been taken to safeguard what he built. Instead, it's taken days, if not weeks, to get to the point where the power elite are realizing that Jindosh is not capable of meeting his responsibilities, not even really able to even take care of himself. But this kind of thing felt more at home in Dunwall, back in the first game. That was a dark and cruel city, and revenge was the whole story. Here, the ambition towards kindness and trying to restore what was broken, a theme that dominates the low chaos playthrough, makes these ironic cruelties stand out as dissonant, even though they're actually more faithful to the first game. That Corvo and Emily should try and undo damages instead of just working harder for a more complicated revenge feels appropriate too. After all, the whole usurping of the throne never would have come together had Emily actually been governing attentively. Other critics have noted that it's odd for Emily to revel so much in the action and magic and blood, that her preference for Corvo's responsibilities over her own actually reflects kind of poorly on her moral character. I feel like the game's placement as a not strictly necessary sequel is the real root of that problem. The first was highly stylized in mood and character design, with a plot that was more like an adult fable than Dishonored 2's attempts at nuance in the characterizations. To have the first game's epilogue talk about Emily's rule as either well-intentioned and well-governed in the low chaos or heartless and selfish in the high chaos fits that vibe. It's a storybook ending. Dishonored 2 cuts right into the middle of that storybook ending and asks if Emily is perhaps naive and short-sighted in her envy of Corvo's more adventurous calling, a question that is way outside the epilogue's tonal scope. When you look at the damage done to Zirkonos, all of that happened under Emily and Corvo's watch, except they weren't watching. They were sparring and training, they were repairing Dunwall, they were comfortable at home. They had come back around to being in the company of the same nobles that you were stabbing, branding, and imprisoning when the nobles were more outwardly hostile during the events of the first game. Delilah's usurping the throne is based on long-standing class resentments that Emily and Corvo's total ignorance of the state of their empire seems to somewhat justify. All of these political critiques are valid, in my opinion, but Emily and Corvo have my sympathies as well. They are shouldering the burden of a more serious-minded sequel on their cartoonishly drawn shoulders. The differing approaches of Dishonored 1 and 2 when it comes to plot and tone clash frequently this way. But the mechanical satisfaction of playing as one character or another with their complementary and contrasting powers and tones, the way each level feels less connected and more artificially separate than in the first game, this all ultimately works in Dishonored 2's favor. And Dishonored 2's more grounded look and feel really does help create a deep sense of plausibility, even with all the magic and pop fantasy flourishes. It's very good at explaining itself visually, but pretty clumsy at explaining itself narratively. Like how the Void and the Outsider are handled. The Void is much darker and sharper than it used to be, a land like Obsidian Islands in an endless sky. Light blue used to be the dominant color in the first game. It's quite a switch. You even get a glimpse into the Outsider's backstory, a soul sacrificed to the Void hundreds of years ago. But your primary purpose in being here is to have some of the villains' backstories clarified, like Delilah telling her backstory in her own words with helpful illustrations. The Void used to be mysterious. Now it's being used as a crutch to explain things to players who might not be reading all the notes you find. It's a frustrating narrative direction to go in, even if the Void does look a lot sharper. Using shrines in the game causes you to actually travel to the Void briefly for an audience with the Outsider, as opposed to him just popping up for a conversation. Less wordy, more dramatic. But the world of magic that felt at home in the rat-infested alleys of Dunwall feels like a world that sunny Karnaca, with its mechanical and scientific wonders mostly under siege by graft and self-interest, feels like it ought to have left behind. Dishonored 2 is a fascinating example of the different sorts of challenges games face in producing sequels than other forms of media. As true multimedia, when the balance of priorities between script and mechanics and aesthetic shifts, it becomes harder and harder to draw a straight line between predecessor and progeny, especially when advances in technology allow for whole new looks and feels for the game world. Dishonored 1's cel-shaded look is a lot less difficult to process for your machine than Dishonored 2's gleaming details, after all. And a successful game can often sell another on the back of its reputation. So the structure was there, the business end seemed to make sense and check out. The only thing standing in the way of Dishonored 2 was the first game's satisfying, functional completeness. The end of the game illustrates this pretty spectacularly. You do Dunwall Tower over again, one last time. You visit the gazebo where Empress Jessamine was murdered last game. The layout of the structure is the same from when you last visited it, both the lower levels, which map identically with when you visited to take down the High Regent in the first game, as well as the upper levels, which map to how they were in the first level of this game. But Delilah has transformed them all. Bodies hang from the rafters, furniture blocks entrances and exits, and the whole place is starting to look like a much less homey Brigmore Manor, which is a pretty disappointing direction to go in. Much is made earlier of how multifaceted Delilah is, and how her grievances have some emotional and political legitimacy to them. But when you get to the tower, she's just the angry, murderous witch lady. The non-lethal path involves corrupting her painting's magic, just like with Daud, but with Daud, swapping out the paintings literally behind her back, he had a tidier experience, a better experience. Here you're presented with some kind of strange alternate reality, the world as it should be, according to Delilah, where her statues sing her eternal praises while she sits on an infinite throne. The non-lethal path traps her in this fantasy, which is probably the easiest a villain's gotten off in Dishonored so far. Then the epilogue goes right back into, and they lived happily ever after, or alternately, and they lived mercilessly ever after territory. After all the deliberate attempts to inject nuance into the story, it ends on a brief, simplistic note that spends a couple slides setting up the DLC, which looks like it'll feature Billy Lurk and the return of Daud. So, no matter how you felt about Emily's neglect of Serkonos, the imperial ignorance that allowed the conspiracy against her to flourish, it goes back to the original storybook ending, after all, at the end. It highlights just how artificial it was to return to the setting for a new story with these characters in the first place. Artificiality, though, is what makes Dishonored 2 so compelling to play. The overall arc of the plot is flatter than a pancake, but the in-the-moment experience of all that in-between time is a consistent joy. Dishonored 2 is an incredibly artful game. It's got beauty, craft, and confidence behind it. It doesn't actually need a good story to be good art, but it sure would have been something if it had. Thanks for watching. I want to take a moment to really thank the people who are supporting me on Patreon. Without your help, I never would be able to do these videos, or live in this bus. This is the first video uploaded from the road. I'm on a big old, possibly infinite road trip. Thanks entirely to support through Patreon. So this is the first of the game videos I'm uploading, and I'm going to continue to do game videos, as I've mentioned, but I have many people to thank. People like Cassie, Tom, Gabriel Nichols, Christian Zacharianson, Eddie Burton, Soeb Sheik, Clayton Crenshaw, Will Hooten, Jake Mays, Dennis Clark, Jake Brennan, Julius Dean, Akiko Mizunami, Alexander Leister, Brian Hill, Igor Babiuk, Kumaran Vision, Justin Hughes, Christopher Girada, Thunder O'Brien, Carlos Marcio, Duarte Piera, Jared Meyer, Cameron Booth, Joaquin Coleman, William Davis, Stephen Garrett Day, Eli Bergmass, Oscar Stangenberg, Egon Elbra, Jeanette N., Yarzin Bargovti, Sean Lees, Eric P., Dios, Garrett Kurnt, Sergey Milosek, John Paul Harcht, Ray Sawyer, Max Fincher, Calypse, Devin Vernon, Balder Carlson, Carl Clark, Max Wellington, Jonathan Holder, Nick Cole Hamilton, Jay Naylor, Rick Storer, Charles Favreau, Kim Winson, Scott Miller, Carol Henderson, Bradley J. Fisher, Matthias Hellstrand, Zach Z, Niles D. McDonald, Will Dobbins, Tom Rauerdink, Zig Kuznieres, Jonas Martinson, Will Wargrave, Jack Harvey, Jack Dawson, Michael Coonan, D-Stex, Robert Glover, Jacob Robinson, Andrew Schiffel, Kevin Schaub, Nathaniel Tenzar, Alexander Dimitriev, Sharif Kenzemi, Trivium Art History, Rob Tackett, Martin Markov, Tim Moon, Divyath Faust, Colby Howard, John Walsh, Alex Zalato, Daniel Mower-Myrie, Stephen Premel, Matthew, Devin Fitzpatrick, Joe Hewison, Sasha Aya, Stephen Potiok, The German Snob, Simo Polakowski, who is not the German Slob. Those are two separate people. Paul Cocker, Jody Warren, Colin, Dylan Sibley, Cameron Jackson, David Fry, Michael Atwell, Brad Carr, Cameron, Bradley Smith, Jeffrey Knutson, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albach, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Martin Karsten, Brett Galmo, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Ivan Marinov, Chris Larkey, Aiden AK-47, Rob Clark, Harley McAvoy, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Joshua Vivi, Tizer Vicarian, Preston Allen, Kimmo Heikkinen, White Zero, Comfy Hat, Ronald Gervais, Marcus Person, Dalton Seiler, Michael Benson, Nobody, Andrew Steele, Sean, Alex Alcald, Urka Mikkonen, Dirk Warbrule, Maja Flyer, Q-Ray X, N.K. Jemson, David Carlson, Evan Hill, Ashley Rain, Brian Plockelman, Chris Kaon, Pay, Brandon Boat, Josh, David Gilbreth, Galak, Morton Scanning, Josh Farkas, Dewey, Niels Brock Frommer, Spyro Sedaris, Connor Biblo, Ryan Gunst, Amir Aguilar, and Sangustan. Much appreciated, and I'm going to continue to try to give you guys back what you're paying for. Thank you. Bye.